What's behind France's Republican Values Bill? First announced amid a fresh wave of terror attacks in the autumn, compounded by that gruesome beheading of a middle school social studies teacher, what was originally built as a law against religious separatism passing the National Assembly this Tuesday. Amendments from the left and the right show that the fault lines over defending laïcité, France's state-sponsored brand of secularism, don't follow traditional left-right divides. They still, though, raise thorny issues. Does the bill target Islam? Does it stifle critical thinking when it comes to laïcité? Is it too invasive? On that score, we'll ask why an article that places curbs on homeschooling has become the most contentious. More broadly, now that we're a little over a year away from a presidential election in France, how's the tone of the conversation evolving? With polls showing the far right narrowing the gap with Macron, does this bill help the incumbent? And how much will identity politics play on the campaign trail? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Emmanuel Macron's secularism bill. With us, Member of Parliament Mireille Clapeau from Macron's La République En Marche party. Welcome back to the show.
Hello.
Commentator and political strategist Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet will be joining us from Paris and from Boston. We're with Carol Ferrara, assistant of a professor of sociology and marketing at Emerson College. Thank you for being with us.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, emblematic and divisive. That's how a French broadsheet of record Le Monde brands the Republican Values Bill, wide-ranging with 51 articles that now face amendments in the Senate, followed by the scrutiny of France's Constitutional Council. Andrew Hillier has more.
France's separatism bill creates a new offence, named after the teacher whose brutal death triggered outrage across the nation. The so-called Samuel Paty amendment aims to clamp down on online hate, punishing those who publish information about people's private lives. Lawbreakers could get up to 3 years in prison and a €45,000 fine. The bill creates a new administrative procedure to temporarily close religious establishments that spread messages of violence. Prefects will have the power to close institutions for 2 months if they become bastions of hate speech. Religious groups will also have to declare any donations worth more than €10,000 from abroad. The government hopes the move will weaken foreign influence on places of worship. NGOs are also set to be reined in, with officials set to obtain new powers to act against groups thought to be spreading extremism. Organizations that apply for state subsidies will have to sign a contract adhering to Republican values. Those in breach of the contract will have to give back any state money handed over. As for women's rights, doctors will now be forbidden to hand over so-called virginity certificates. The law also beefs up the state's powers to clamp down on forced marriages and polygamy. One of the most controversial aspects of the bill tightens the rules on homeschooling. But the government has already backpedaled twice. It watered down a total ban, instead forcing parents to obtain permission from local education authorities to teach their children at home. And now, in the face of ongoing criticism, the government has added a transition period, giving parents until 2024 to adapt to the new changes.
We'll ask about that homeschooling portion of the bill and why it's so controversial. But first, let's go to the National Assembly. France 24's Sharon Gaffney has been covering the vote. Tell us more about the reactions.
Well, Francois, the vote in the end, as expected, it was passed easily through the upper house here at Parliament by 347 votes in favour to 151 against. So before the actual vote took place, we had each of the parties again outlining the reasons why they were either supporting or opposed to the legislation. In the end, the right-wing Les Républicains, they voted against the legislation, as did Jean-Luc Mélenchon's far-left party. The Socialist Party on the left, they abstained. And Marine Le Pen and her colleagues, there was no sign of them. They were missing in action today and didn't turn up for the actual vote. In reality, it didn't really matter whether or not Emmanuel Macron gained the support of the left and the right. He had enough of a working majority here to get the legislation passed. He did get the support, obviously, of the centrist Modem party. Now, that said, there's been a lot of debate, particularly, as you heard in Andrew's package there about the Article 21, which is the homeschooling initiative. That really has been the most contentious aspect. But in general terms, this bill, this legislation, it's had a lot of criticism in terms of, coming from the Muslim community, many of whom believe that this unfairly stigmatizes them, but others on the right saying, well, actually, this bill doesn't go enough. It doesn't even refer to what it's supposed to be aimed at and supposed to be focusing on. As Emmanuel Macron said in that speech back in October, he said his government would be bringing forward legislation aimed at tackling Islamist separatism, but those words don't actually appear anywhere in this text.
And that's because we can say that it wouldn't be constitutional to single out a single religion.
But the Muslim community does feel that regardless as to whether or not those terms do appear in the legislation, the measures that are being introduced, they feel clearly do target them. In particular, where we have homeschooling, the Catholic Church has also expressed concern about that particular initiative, as have parents of some of the 62,000 children here in France who are homeschooled. But the Muslim community, specific measures, including the fines or the imprisonment that doctors will now face if they issue these so-called virginity tests, the sanctions that are going to be introduced for polygamy and for forced marriages. The Muslim community believe that those particular issues are aimed at them, and they believe that it's further stigmatization. Another criticism of this bill is that it's really another symbol of Emmanuel Macron's government moving more towards the right, really with an eye on the presidential elections next year. So that's one thing that really unites those on the left, those on the right. All who are opposed to this legislation are united in the belief that they feel this is simply just window dressing, that it's not actually going to have much of a practical impact, and it's really just politically motivated.
All right, many thanks for that. Sharon Gaffney reporting live from the French Parliament. Mireille Clapeau, lots to pick through there. Does this bill target Islam?
This bill doesn't target any religion specifically, but it's in favor of the Republican values, and it establishes that the Republican values have the priority towards the religious preceptors, and Muslims shouldn't feel targeted because really, except for maybe polygamy, certificates of virginity that very often are requested by Muslim people, but nowhere you will find specifically the word Muslim. It's aimed to establish the priority of freedom, equality, fraternity, and of course secularism.
Now, the other criticism, big criticism we've heard, is that a lot of what is being introduced already exists on the books, in particularly the laws that were established at the beginning of the 20th century that laid out the principles of secularism in France. Was this bill needed?
Yes, it was needed because you're right. There is a very powerful law in France. It's the law of 1905 that establishes the separation between government, state, and religion. But my prefect, where I live in Rome, told me that as far as associations were concerned, for example, if they had strange practices, if they had hate speeches, if they were suspected to not respect equality between girls and boys, it was very difficult to stop their activity. And now, with this bill of law, there will be direct tools for the police and justice to sanction them.
Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. When we last visited this topic, when the bill last time we discussed it, it was in the heat of the shock, you might say, after the beheading of that middle school teacher, Samuel Paty. Now that a few months have passed, what would you say is the tone in France when it comes to this bill? Is it the same?
Yeah, first of all, it's not the center of the preoccupations for the French people. They are more preoccupied at very high rates, like 90%, by the economic situation and by the unemployment, the rise of the unemployment, economic difficulties, and of course the sanitary conditions and the virus, the COVID-19, etc. But there is the one agenda is the popular agenda, and the other agenda is the political agenda. And we see the rise in the preoccupations from the political parties, especially from the government parties, the majority parties. They are more and more preoccupied by these topics because it helps them, aligning themselves with the right, on the right. And it's very important, it's key to the strategy of Emmanuel Macron if he wants to be re-elected in 2022. He needs to get rid of any competition that he might have. And we even saw a minister, Macron's minister for the Interior, the Home Office in France, Gérald Darmanin, on TV, said to our far-right leader, Marine Le Pen, that she was maybe too soft. So that tells you a bit about the atmosphere, politically speaking. It's not something that people have in mind, really. They are preoccupied by more urgent things. But the politicians are keen on speaking about it because it helps them, getting organized for the next presidential race.
We're going to play that clip of Gérald Darmanin in a little while there, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet. But it's not just left versus right, isn't it? Surveys show that public opinion do favor stronger measures to defend secularism. There was an annual survey commissioned on the subject that finds that less than a quarter of citizens feel that secularism is not discussed enough in the media and public debate. They say, according to that survey, now these results were published in January, that they want it discussed even more, in fact. 6 out of 10 feel that secularism, by the way, isn't taught enough in schools. Philippe, is on this topic, is Macron simply reflecting the will of the French public?
He knows that the right, the voters on the right and conservative voters have this feeling, and he wants to tap into that. I'm not saying that it's not a preoccupation, especially because of terrorism. And since we see terror attacks on a regular basis, it's been implemented in our national debate, these questions. I'm not saying people are not willing to defend secularism. We all want to do that. I'm just saying that these measures that are being passed now won't change a thing. As you said, they are cosmetic. And if they do these measures, if they pass these measures, we have laws that are really, really strong regarding secularism. Maybe we should talk about it more in schools. It's been debated for the last 30 years, whether we should or shouldn't do that. We had even a government, a government on the left that wanted to, raise the flag, raise the colors in the schools in the mornings and sing the national anthem. So we've been talking at length about all these topics, really. Maybe there is a need to talk more about them. The most popular TV show now in France is called Therapy. It's a national. We need a national discussion on every topic like this, but I don't think we need a law. And that's if we go as far as to pass a new law, it's because there is a need for political advertising, and it is very different from a national debate.
So, Carol Ferrara, there's been a controversy within the controversy, and that is how American media has reported on what's happening here with this bill on Republican values. Do you feel there's misunderstanding? Are the French misunderstood when it comes to this measure?
So I would say that from an American perspective, we look at national identity in a really different way than national identity is seen in France. We've always embraced a sort of hybrid model of national identity. And so when there's laws that are created that seem to stifle the way one is allowed to express their identities, whether it's religious identities or cultural identities, then it seems a little shocking to us. That said, these are universal problems that we see in liberal democracies across the world. So these questions of how to have a coherent national identity while also managing this great diversity therein is a common problem for democracies everywhere.
And
here in the U.S.
The big surprise here has been, of course, that among those 51 articles, and we saw in that report at the outset just how wide-ranging this bill is, the one that's drawn in the last couple of weeks the most attention is Article 21, which has to do with homeschooling. At first, they were talking about a ban. Now it's been reworked a little bit. Carol, you wrote for the Conversation the following, that there is no evidence that Muslim schools, independent schools, or homeschooling are the root of the problem of radicalization and Islamic separatism in France.
I did. So what I would say is, this homeschooling debate in particular is not new. But historically, it's very seldom been associated with Islam or with the Muslim population, comparatively speaking. So it feels really out of place here. The vast majority of Muslim families actually send their kids to public schools, and then others, maybe the private sous contrat system, or with Catholic or Muslim schools, and then hors contrat private schools, and then lastly homeschooling. So it's not really been an issue there.
With contractors, just to remind our viewers, with contractors, the schools that get state subsidies and right. So hors contrat are not subsidized by the government, and sous contrat are. But the real crux of these homeschooling debates, which are rather parallel to debates over independent schooling in France or this hors contrat schooling, is a question of who the primary educators of French children are, whether or not this should be the state or if it's parents. A few years ago, there was that famous episode where the senator controversially stated that children don't belong to their parents. And the quote was somewhat manipulated in the media, but it represents this ideology against which parents who choose to homeschool or send their children to independent schools have of the state discourse. That the state sees themselves as the primary educators of French children, since they're future French citizens, and the sort of instead of the parents. And the lowering recently of the age where it's obligatory to go to school, it was lowered to 3 years old. Your thoughts on that?
So I think that this, like my colleague was saying, I think that this isn't going to actually change very much. The families, most families sort of want to send their children to school at 3 because they work, and usually both parents work. And then those parents who want to keep their children home, I mean, the families who are homeschooling, there's a lot of traditionalist Catholic families who homeschool, or other religious families who want to provide a stronger foundation of religious education. Lots of families with children with learning or physical disabilities who have not found the public system accommodating enough to their needs, or just families with a stay-at-home parent who would simply prefer to be able to teach their children in a way that best represents their family or community values. And I think those will be the families who are going to persist in this debate and who are going to ask for that permission.
I want to pick up on this. We have to take a very quick break. We'll be right back. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at that Republican values bill, what was originally branded as a law against religious separatism, that was just been passed by the French National Assembly. We're talking about it with French Member of Parliament Mireille Clapeau from Emmanuel Macron's La République En Marche party. Commentator and political strategist Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet is with us as well. And from Boston, Carol Ferrara, assistant professor of sociology and marketing at Emerson College. Mireille Clapeau, you heard just before the break Carol Ferrara talking about this whole issue of homeschooling, why it became so controversial, the fact that they wanted to scrap it. What your thoughts on the way it's come out in the bill in the end? Would you have been in favor of a ban on homeschooling?
Yes, to be honest, I think that the basis of our republic is education, but education that mixes people, and the mixity is really a value, a republican value we have to promote. And we think there is a danger if a very young girl of boy is included in a very small in a very small group of people, and hearing all the time that, for example, God laws are more important than republic laws, and therefore we thought it was better to have this modification of the law, and now it's the exception, but exception will be widely attributed.
So this is one of the criticisms. They said that some of the parliamentarians saying there wasn't enough data. And we don't know how many, because there have been cases of kids being found who weren't put in school by their parents and were, to a certain degree, radicalized. But are they minute exceptions or not? We don't quite know, do we?
I think there is good homeschooling and bad homeschooling. And of course, parents want the best for their children. But in some cases, it's for bad reasons. And therefore, the public administration of education will be able to determine whether it's a good education or a bad education. And again, mixity is very good for the development of the citizens.
Carol Ferrara, did it come from a good intention, trying to save these children from being radicalized, or is it a dog whistle message to the far right? How many of these, let's talk about it bluntly, how many of these Muslim children were homeschooled in a way that's preoccupying?
So I think that you're right, that there's really a lack of statistics to prove any of this. Obviously, if they're not showing up for school, then there's very little data to track them. But you know what I think is, if it comes back to this question of identity in terms of whether or not the bill was well-intentioned, because certainly from an outside perspective, and certainly from the perspective of combating Islamist separatism, homeschooling just does not meet the criteria for being one of the main roots, the primary roots of these issues. But if it's a question about strengthening control over narratives of national identity, and having control over what kind of history, collective memory, a common culture being transmitted through education, this harks back to the formation of the modern school system in the Third Republic, and obviously still resonates today. And it's a question of whether or not the state should be allowed to dictate children's perceptions of the world, their moral compasses, and their identities, or whether parents ultimately are the deciders in shaping their children's futures.
Yeah, and this whole discussion, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, about homeschooling happens to come in a pandemic year where a lot of parents have had to scramble to teach their children, especially during that first lockdown that we saw here in France. Yeah, I mean, you have your thoughts on why this whole issue of homeschooling became such a flashpoint.
I think we all had an experience this year of homeschooling, and I can tell you, Francois, that's not the most popular thing nowadays in French households. It was a shock for everyone to understand how precious the job of that teachers do on a daily basis is, because you can't possibly replace a teacher from scratch, and we all understand that now. I don't know why really we are in it looks like the question we ask ourselves is, are we secular enough? Do we need to redo the work that we did in 1905 when the first secular law was passed, our most fundamental law was passed? Do we need to do the job all over again because of the terror attacks? Because we don't understand that new religion that has become the second most important religion in France, and maybe we have trouble with accepting that too. So we use bits of things that are mostly fantasies, mostly fears, mostly really not rational fears that we might have, and we use them politically in order to, I don't know, get it out of our system. We have to admit as a society that we are not Christian anymore. I mean, we are many religions at once. I'm a Christian from Russian origins. I'm an Orthodox. That's not the same brand of Christianity as others might have, but I live my religion happily. And I think we should all try to work that way so that everyone can live happily his religion. And it has turned to something very different nowadays, which is can we bear to live with the Muslims? And the French society seems to have real issues with that. And the politicians play with that in order to gain some traction, some popularity. And obviously, it's not easy to fight the COVID. Obviously, it's the most difficult thing to fight the COVID, especially in the EU, when you have no control over your borders, for instance. It's maybe easier to play with that kind of fears and to raise that kind of a topic. But honestly, we have other things to think about. We have a huge economic crisis. We have sanitary conditions that are really dire in the poorest neighborhoods in our country because they don't have any protection against the virus. And we need to address that issues if we want our economy to go again. And several of my friends are unemployed because they lost their jobs, because restaurants are closed.
So that for you is the top issue. Mireille Clapeau, France, home to Europe's largest Muslim population, in excess of 5 million people. Do you fear that many of them will feel stigmatized by this bill?
First of all, I would like to react to what I heard, if I may. Of course, people have other topics in mind, but the basis of our republic is very important. The link between people and the fight of hate speeches, complotism, etc. This is very important because we have to build on this. To come back to your question, I think that Muslim people do not have to fear anything because the republic laws guarantee the freedom of worship and of religion. It's secularism. If there are some extremists, if they do not respect the law of republic, equality between men and women, if they disagree, for example, with the content of the school programs, if they want to behead or kill somebody, of course, they can fear this law. But for most of the Muslim people, it's more freedom, I think.
You have the leader of the far right, Marine Le Pen, who at times has liberally mixed the words Islam and Islamism. And we saw last week there was this primetime debate between Le Pen and the Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin, who pointed to members of her own party who he says are more radical.
Madame Le Pen, dans sa stratégie de dédiabolisation, on vient à être quasiment un peu dans la mollesse. Je vous trouve, faut vous reprendre des vitamines. Vous n'êtes pas assez dur, je trouve, là. Si je crois vos distinctions entre ce que dit M. Ravier, ce que dit Madame Le Pen, maréchal, ce que dit M. Collard, il y a vraiment une différence forte. Effectivement, vous êtes prête, si je comprends bien, à ne même pas légiférer sur les cultes et vous dites que l'islam n'est même pas un problème. Vraiment, vous êtes parti assez loin, ça va décevoir beaucoup de vos électeurs, j'imagine, ce soir.
So he seems there, Mireille Clapeau, to be egging her on to be more hardline. Do you agree with the tactics used there by Gérald Darmanin?
Well, I know that Gérald Darmanin likes humor, and maybe certainly it was to point out she had to change her speech, which is the truth, because she wants to be president of the French Republic. So she
It didn't sound ironic, though, his words. I mean, this is the same man who complained that there's halal food at the supermarket.
Well, I know Marine Le Pen. She's racist. She's against a certain category of people, and it is not the case for Gérald Darmanin, our Minister of Interior. And our project, the project I have in La République En Marche, it's not against these people, but it's in favor of Republicans. So I do not have the same interpretation than you have.
And the words that you heard him employ, though, do you then agree with what Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet said, which is it's clearly Emmanuel Macron is trying to convince her voters?
Well, what I can say is that I would have appreciated this law to promote equal opportunities, because I have a small regret. I voted the law. I have a small regret. It's something severe to prevent associations, schools, etc., to do bad things. I think that we have to improve the other side, the equal opportunities, and then I will be fully satisfied.
Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, when Emmanuel Macron ran for president in 2017, he had this famous phrase, at the same time. So he's saying at the same time, things from the left are good. At the same time, things from the right are good. Is this the end of at the same time?
No, on the contrary, I think it's an example of at the same time. I mean, Gérald Darmanin tried to be at the same time on the less radical side than Marine Le Pen, and at the same time on the more radical side. So I think Emmanuel Macron, what he wants to achieve is to be the incarnation of every political sides there are, and try to encompass all the political spectrum so there wouldn't be any serious competition. And maybe if the Front National, Rassemblement National, maybe if the far right remains as a competitor, it's okay, because he doesn't expect it to win. So he can play with it, push it a little bit up, upwards, so that it gains some strengths, but clearly giving at the same time, clearly giving the message to its voters that, well, maybe they have alternative, and the alternative could be himself. So it's a very dangerous game, obviously.
Yeah, it's a very dangerous game. If the presidential election were held tomorrow, surveys suggest the runoff would feature a rematch between Macron and Le Pen, just like in 2017. However, back then, Macron won 2/3 of the vote. It would be much tighter. One opinion poll, Philippe, last month put Macron winning 52 to 48%. That survey by Harris Interactive may be an outlier. Maybe it's not correct.
No, there is a fundamental problem. You're right to use to quote that numbers, François. There is one main issue. In 2017, he was elected against the establishment, the political establishment. He was not the incarnation of the political establishment. So he gained traction from the fact that French people are angry as hell against their politicians. But this time, he's the guy in charge. So we don't know really how the anger will be managed on behalf of the French people. And it could be that he could even reach, maybe he couldn't reach the second run of the election. Maybe he could be out of the game very much sooner, because people will get angry in 2022. We don't know. So it's a dangerous game, because we don't even know what the situation will be in 1 year, and it's impossible to know if the country will be in a normal state to vote in a normal way. So it's very it's a game that is really troublesome.
Carol Ferrari, I noticed there was a presidential election recently where you are, and over there it was the candidate who tried to steer a little bit further away from identity politics who won. Your thoughts on what you're witnessing here in France?
Well, what I'm witnessing in France is really this crystallization of France's identity around these French Republican principles, and I think that's dangerous for a lot of reasons. In first part, because laïcité has not proven to equate with French belonging, and so a lot of French Muslim citizens who do their best to adhere to these French Republican values, especially laïcité, still find themselves excluded from French belonging and still can't find their place as in terms of being seen as equal French citizens. And so I think whether or not it's teaching more about laïcité in schools or creating more laws that sort of emphasize and underscore the importance of these French principles sort of, throws this reality of Muslim identity not and perhaps never being seen as a legitimate possible representation of French national identity, really in the face of many citizens. And so, hopefully there'll be new, more multilateral solutions in the future to bring Muslims more in the spotlight in terms of creating France's future instead of always having these top-down initiatives for reform.
Let me get Mireille Clapeau's reaction to that, because on the one hand, there's this bill on Republican values. On the other hand, there's been this commission on France's colonial past. And again, if we want to include the descendants of that colonial heritage, who've come from, most notably, from places like North Africa, what needs to be done on that score?
Well, I think the main problem we have in France is social discrimination. You don't have equal opportunities whether you live in a suburb of Paris, Lyon, Marseille, or even Valence, where I live. And if you have an address in downtown, in the very center of the cities, in principle, you have equal access to school, to health, to all the public services, but in reality, it's very difficult, and we are trying to reduce the gap between these people from the suburbs and the educated people. And it's not a problem of whether their parents or grandparents live in Africa or in Algeria.
But Carol's point is whether or not they feel as though they belong, that they really are full-fledged French citizens.
Well, when there are some wedding ceremonies, for example, very often they have a flag from the country of their parents or their grandparents. But if you ask them, do you prefer to live in France or to live in Algeria, Africa? Of course, they say, I feel French. So we have to respect the culture of their parents and grandparents, but we have to integrate them with the social lift and with the French education and to incorporate them in the Republican values. It's a challenge, I think. It's not so easy, but it has nothing to see with religion discrimination, for example.
Carol Ferrar?
So I would just say it's really hard to integrate people who are already citizens. A lot of the Muslim youth that I spoke with in France would just consistently say, of course I'm French. Of course I don't know what else I would be if I wasn't French, but I never feel French because people don't, my fellow citizens don't see me as being French. And so that's why I think this emphasis on laïcité, which has really become a facade for, coercive assimilationist rhetoric, is really just exacerbating the social problems and the social fractures, rather than finding better ways to teach about a more inclusive national identity and finding ways for Muslims also to be representative of French identity.
Mireille Clapeau, one final question. You heard Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet mention how the pandemic right now is the issue. As we head into this campaign period, is it a good idea to talk about identity politics, or is it better to steer clear of it and just focus on the public health crisis and on the economy?
Again, I don't use the word identity because you never see Islam, you never see identity in the Bill of Law. But it's in favor of the Republican values. And again, it has nothing to see with religion. It's to promote equality of opportunities.
But will Emmanuel Macron be putting the accent on these kinds of issues going forward, or will it be about the economy and about the health system?
But please remember that 6 years ago there were Charlie Hebdo, then there was the Bataclan, the terrorist attacks, and we are deeply marked by these events. And then there was a beheading of Samuel Paty. So there is still a problem. And in the public schools today, there are always contestations of the content of the programs, and there are always difficulties with signs of religion. There is a neutrality. And the neutrality, in law there is neutrality, but on the field neutrality is not always respected. And I think this is a concern. So
concern of citizens, of
course,
voters.
Yes, we have to solve the pandemic, and we have to solve the economical crisis, but this is important for French people, I think.
Mireille Clapeau, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet for being with us from Boston. Carol Ferrara, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.